right, are we ready to get the jurors in?
Jury's entering the courtroom.
Thank you, Deputy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Were you all able to abide by my instructions during the recess? All right. And I guess we're ready to begin. Mr. Escobar?
Your Honor, the defense would call Detective Aaron Smith.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you shall give in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Go ahead, Mr. Escobar.
Good morning, Detective Smith.
Good morning, sir.
Detective Smith, let's talk a little bit about your law enforcement experience. I believe you started somewhere in maybe 1999 in New Hampshire, is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, and that was a small town that you were a law enforcement officer in, is that correct?
Yes, it's
About
correct.
8,000?
I think roughly somewhere between 7,500, 8,000 people around there.
And in that department, there were about 15 police officers, and 2 of them were detectives?
Generally, the numbers of detectives would change here and there, but there's usually 1 or 2 people assigned as a detective.
And it's my understanding that the Attorney General's office would actually be in charge of handling homicides there in New Hampshire, is that correct?
It was generally a combination of the Attorney General's office and state police major crimes that did the investigations.
Okay. And while you were working, I guess you worked there for about 11 years, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And again, New Hampshire, that little town was not a very violent town.
No, not particularly, no.
And so during that period of time, those 11 years, I believe you assisted in homicides, assisted at the Attorney General's office, who was lead, right?
Yes, sir.
On 2 occasions, is that correct?
As I recall, 2, yes.
So you didn't have a whole lot of experience in dealing with homicides back in New Hampshire, is that correct?
They weren't very common in that town, no.
Okay. Now, likewise, even in your assisting the Attorney General, you really didn't have much experience in dealing with the issue of self-defense in a homicide.
I don't think either one of the cases that we investigated involved a self-defense argument, no.
Okay. So in 2009, 11 years in New Hampshire, 2009 you come to Pasco.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct? And you're hired, it's my understanding, as a patrol officer.
Yes, sir.
And so between 2009 and 2011, that's exactly what you did? Patrol officer?
Yes, sir, till about 2012. Yes, sir.
Till about 2012. And you were doing that patrol duty in a very small town here in Pasco County, is that correct?
No, I work for the Sheriff's Office, so our duties are countywide, so the entirety of the county.
Was there a Meadow Point area that you were responsible for?
There was a time in patrol that I was assigned as a contract deputy to the Meadow Point area, yes.
How long was that contract in that small community of Meadow Point?
I think about a year. Well, it was an ongoing contract, but I think my assignment there was about a year.
About a year, okay. And so in 2012, I guess it was a year, because 2011, right, is when you left patrol.
I believe it was
2012?
2012.
Okay, is that when you went to the detective division?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the detective division that you went to was major crimes. However, your responsibility primarily in major crimes was to investigate missing persons. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And then in 2000 and I guess 13 is when you moved over to major crimes, dealing primarily with homicides.
Yes, sir. It was the same squad that I was on, but my assignment changed to be a major crimes detective.
But that didn't happen until December of 2013.
I think that's correct, yes, sir.
Okay. So you would agree as a police officer throughout all these years, you had some training in threat assessment and use of force.
Yes, sir.
It's part of your work as a police officer. You have to be well-versed in being able to pick up those cues that could put you in danger.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Correct.
And that's pretty much for all police officers, is that correct?
That's a pretty basic training for everybody, yes.
Okay. And the assessing of danger, those skills, that's not easy, is it?
It's complex, I guess you would say.
Complex?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You,
I have an objection, may we approach?
Yes. Go ahead, Mr. Escobar.
thank you, Your Honor. Detective, you are taught in your profession and how to respond to life-threatening situations, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there are a variety of cues or indications that you have to look at, correct? In when to respond.
I guess you would say to respond to an individual person or decide how you were going to handle the situation, yes.
Exactly, the threat situation, right? And one of the things you're going to look at is you're going to look at environment, right? You want to know what environment you're in, right?
Yes, sir.
And you're going to look and see if it's dark, right?
Yes, sir.
Because if it's dark, you're in a dark area, it puts you at a disadvantage.
It could, yes.
And if you're in close proximity to someone, it could put you at a disadvantage.
It gives you less time to react to what happens, yes, sir.
And if the relative size and age of the individuals, that could put you at a disadvantage.
May I object? We approach.
Okay.
You would agree that the process of reacting to those cues takes time.
Yes, sir. You have to take time to make decisions about what your actions are going to be.
You got to see it, you got to be able to process it, and then you got to be able to react, right?
Correct, yes,
That
sir.
takes time.
Yes.
You also are looking for, we talked about the size of the individual, correct?
That's definitely something you would consider, yes.
And facial expressions and bowing up and fighting stance and those things, correct?
Yes, sir.
You would also look to see if his actions are out of character for the location, right? Like if you're in a church and you're getting up and screaming profanities at everyone, that's out of character for church, right?
I don't think that the physical surrounding like that makes as much difference as like physical obstacles, things like that to look at, because...
Let's talk about that if we can.
Okay.
So you're saying that someone getting up in a church and yelling profanities is not alarming?
It's definitely alarming, yes.
Because it has an indication that that person may be out of control, correct?
Well, it indicates that there's something abnormal going on.
You want to assess individuals as to whether they're in control or out of control, right?
That's definitely a consideration, yes.
Because out of control individuals are much more dangerous.
They can be, yes.
And you agree, I think we talked about this before, hands can kill,
Yes.
and hands can cause great bodily harm,
Yes, they could.
and hands are particularly dangerous because they're the most coordinated parts of our bodies, right?
Yes, sir.
Your head is extremely sensitive and prone to serious injury, right? Your head?
Yes, sir.
They control a lot of our bodily functions, right? They're the computer in our bodies.
Yes, sir. Your brain obviously is running the show.
And so if your head's being exposed to danger,
Your Honor, objection, same objection you had at the bench. Relevance.
I'll overrule.
so if your head is being exposed to danger, it's a more critical situation for you.
Again, it's a overall consideration in your decision to act.
And you have to do all these things within split seconds.
Depending on the situation, it could be yes.
Now, you've had some training in classwork, correct? In simulation classwork?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean,
Meaning
sir.
where they put you in different situations, you've got to act appropriately.
Oh, simulated training? Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
And in many of those, you fail, right?
It all depends on your reactions to the situation.
But you failed, right?
Yeah, I'm sure I have failed before, yes.
It's not a good feeling when you fail, right?
No, sir.
Because if it was in real life, you die. Could.
You could, yes, sir.
You also are aware that physiologically, certain things go on in one's body when they're in fear.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, if we can, your day that day when you were called to come over to the Cobb Theater on January the 13th of 2014.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember that day?
Yes, I do, sir.
And you were out with another detective actually doing some investigations concerning a missing persons. Is that correct?
Yes, with Detective Moyer.
Okay. Tell me what you did. What time did you get there?
I think it was approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, somewhere around that time. We were over on the west side of the county, so we were probably about a half an hour, 40-minute drive away when I got called, asked to respond there. And then, so I think it was around 2 o'clock that we got the call, and it was probably around 2:25, 2:30, somewhere there, that we got to Wesley Chapel.
And when you got there, your first assignment was not to be the lead crime scene detective. Your first assignment was you were just going to interview some witnesses, right?
I was specifically asked to interview Mrs. Reeves and their son.
And you were asked to interview those witnesses by Sergeant Harris?
Detective Harris, who was the acting sergeant at that point.
Acting Sergeant?
Yep.
I'll leave it with Detective Harris. Acting Detective Harris is way too much.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and so at the time that you arrived at the Cobb Theater, you had only been the crime scene detective on one homicide before this one, correct?
Correct.
And certainly it wasn't of the magnitude of this investigation. You would agree with that?
I guess I don't understand what you mean by the magnitude.
Well, this was a case that had, 100-plus witnesses, and it was in a theater. It was quite involved, right?
Yes, sir. There was a lot more time involved, and I guess you would say the amount of witnesses made it much more time intensive.
And at the time that you arrived at the theater, you were brand new in dealing with homicides, correct?
I wouldn't say I was brand new, no, sir.
Or you were brand new to the division that held homicides, right? Because you were a missing persons before. You assisted homicides while you were a missing person detective, but now you were a homicide detective, right?
Yes, sir. When I was assigned as missing persons, anytime the squad is on call in major crimes and a homicide comes, everyone on the squad responds. So missing persons detectives came out. So any major incident, attempted homicide, the missing persons detectives would come and get assigned a role generally, but it was not one of the main roles in the case.
And certainly you had only been assigned one time before as a crime scene detective,
Yes, sir.
right? And you had only had one self-defense homicide case that you were involved in, right?
Yes, sir.
Before Mr. Reeves's case.
Yes, correct.
Now, in your experience as a police officer, throughout your 11 years in New Hampshire and your years with the Pasco Sheriff's Office, you certainly realized, even before you went to the cop theater, the value of video evidence, right?
Yes, sir.
And you recognize that video evidence is critical if it's there.
Obviously, if it recorded part of the incident, you'd want to get the video so that you can view it, yes.
It gives you an independent view, correct?
Depending on what the video is and what it captures, it's giving you, I guess, a view without any opinion involved.
And if you're fortunate enough to be able to view the video before you conduct interviews of witnesses, that really helps, because it could bring a myriad of questions that you can pose to the witness that you're interviewing.
The video can definitely help you understand what the witness's statements mean and what was actually happening at the time, yes.
And question witnesses about what you see in the video,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So it gives you a much better perspective of doing a thorough interview of a witness.
It's all dependent on the video and what it captures, but if it captures enough of what you need to know, then yes, it can definitely be beneficial.
Now, you would agree that when you arrived, the general rule in your homicide division was that you are not to be the lead detective on the case, on the homicide case, until you've gone and taken the homicide course that's required within your department, right?
Yes, I don't think it was a written policy, but that was the general accepted rule, yes.
And when you arrived at the cop theater on January the 13th of 2014, you had not taken that course yet.
Not yet, no, sir.
And about the only training that you had received in homicide investigations was whatever assistance you provided between, I guess, 2012 and 2013, when you were in the missing persons division, right? You were assisting homicide with interviews and what have you.
Yes, sir.
And you shadowing Detective Proctor, because you didn't have any formal in-service training when you first went into the homicide division. You basically were assigned a detective, Detective Proctor, and you just followed him around.
I guess I don't completely understand. I mean, I'd had multiple trainings over the years throughout law enforcement that involved, interviews with people, crime scene preservation, processing crime scenes for fingerprints.
Yeah, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about specific to being a homicide detective. When you go in to that division, you've gone away from missing persons, now you're in the homicide division. There's no formal training, classroom training that you go through when you become a homicide detective. You basically get someone to shadow, correct? And you take your homicide course, which you hadn't taken yet, and you're on your way.
We have what we call a field training program, detective field training program. So like Detective Proctor was assigned as my detective field training officer, and yes, I would then be educated by him on policies, procedures, and then shadow him on any of his cases to learn.
And that's what that field training is. It's really a shadowing process. You're trying to learn from someone that you hope has more experience and more knowledge concerning the investigation of homicides than you would, right?
It's a shadowing as well as an evaluation, because it's for Detective Proctor to evaluate my knowledge and my ability to learn as we do things, yes.
So you were going to be evaluated by Detective Proctor?
Yes, sir.
Okay. You would agree that the two main detectives in a homicide are the crime scene detective and the lead detective?
It all depends on the case. I mean, you can have multiple jobs. We sometimes call people a secondary to a primary, so that would be probably a more important job than some. But each job's important, which is why we break it down into individual jobs when we're processing a major scene.
So you were initially assigned to do some interviews,
Yes, sir.
and you started to do those interviews there at the Cobb Theater. And so I would imagine that when you were doing those interviews, that you had your tape recorder with you.
I did not know, sir.
Now, you would agree with me, would you not, that a tape recorder for a homicide detective is a very important tool?
Yes, sir.
Because you want to capture not only the testimony of that particular witness, but you want to capture the emotion and everything that that conversation entails, right?
The recording can be useful, yes, sir.
For that purpose, right?
For several different purposes, yes.
That
And to
being-
include that.
Emotion, pausing for long periods of time, maybe not knowing that answer. You want to capture all of that, right? So that at some point in time, we can present it to the jury and they can listen to it for themselves, right?
You have to use it to assist you in writing your reports because an audio recording is not necessarily going to capture emotion. You know, some of it could be in the tone of someone's voice, but a lot of it might be visually. You're looking at their face. You're describing their reactions. So
Someone's crying, you capture that, right?
it depends. I mean, if they're audibly sobbing, would it capture it? Yes. If they weren't, I mean,
And
if they had
someone's
tears, then
saying, oh, you know, let me think about that, you know, man, you capture all that, right?
anything audible you would capture. Yes,
And
sir.
those are good things for everybody, right?
Yes, they can be.
Because at the end of the day, we want the truth, the absolute truth to come out, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, you did not go into the crime scene, and I'm going to call it crime scene, but I'm also going to call it incident scene.
Your Honor, I object.
Judge, I'll call it crime scene. If he wants me to call it crime scene, I'll call it crime scene. You didn't go into the crime scene, is that correct?
Well, for this case and most cases like this, we had kind of like layers of crime scene, we would call it. So we would limit people from coming in and out of the building altogether, and then we would have the interior crime scene is the room where the actual crime occurred.
My question to you is, did you go into Theater 10 before you went to go and interview Mrs. Reeves? Yes or no?
No, I did not. I did not go into Theater 10 before the interviews.
And did anyone prior to doing that interview give you a complete outline of what, you knew there were officers in that Theater 10, right?
Yes, sir. The forensics investigators had started their process in there.
And there were officers as well.
Officers, yes, that are dealing with security and things like that.
Harris was in there.
I'm not sure. I would assume, yes, he was in there, but I can't tell you that for certain.
And so you didn't get any sort of briefing as to what specifically was in that crime scene prior to going and interviewing Mrs. Reeves?
I know Detective Harris gave me an overall synopsis of what had occurred during the shooting, but I do not recall a crime scene specific information from him.
And so the recorders are important, but you don't have a recorder, is that correct?
I did not have it with me, no, sir.
And do you think that the recorder was in your car?
I honestly don't know.
You never went to go to your car to check?
I did not go back to the car, no, sir.
That's normally where you keep it, right?
It could have been at my office, at my desk. It could have been in the car because obviously when you're done with interviews, you take your recorder out to transfer the recordings to your computer while you're typing. So it could have been at my office. I honestly don't know where it was at that time.
But you didn't even bother to search?
I did not go back to the car to look for it, no, sir.
Well, since there was such a battalion of officers there at the Cobb Theater, I'm sure it would have been quite easy to ask any one of them for their recorders.
In hindsight, yes, I could have asked somebody.
You should have, right?
Yes, sir, I should have.
Now, you would agree the first one that you interviewed was Mrs. Reeves, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you remember Mrs. Reeves being vividly upset, correct? Crying?
I think I believed it was visibly, not vividly necessarily, but
Both.
yes, she was obviously upset to me, yes.
Crying, physically shaking?
Yes, sir.
And you recognize her to be in her 70s and a very thin woman?
I do remember being small frame, yes, sir.
Now, in that particular interview, I would imagine that you wanted to try to get some indication of what the setting was when the shooting took place, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so did you ask Mrs. Reeves what the lighting conditions were during the previews when this event happened?
I do remember her telling me that it was during the
Objection, hearsay.
Listing.
Well, I'm asking if he even asked her about it. There's no answer yet. Did you ask Miss Reeves what the lighting conditions were inside the theater?
I don't remember if I asked a specific question. I do know that we discussed the lighting conditions in general, meaning that the previews were on and that it was a darkened movie theater.
Did you ask Miss Reeves how loud the previews were?
I don't recall asking that, no.
You realize that both sight and hearing are the two most vital senses that we have, correct?
Yes, sir.
In assessing situations, right?
Yes, sir.
We get information through our ears, right?
Yes, correct.
And we get information through our eyes
Yes.
that we process.
Yes, sir.
But you didn't ask her how loud it was.
I don't recall asking that, no, sir.
You know what backlighting is, right?
If you mean a light being behind a subject, sir, yes, I do.
Okay, and so you've been to theaters before?
Yes, sir.
And did you know, when you interviewed her, that Mr. Oulson was standing directly in front of her and Mr. Reeves?
Yes, I would have known that at the time, yes.
You would have known that. And so, did you ask her whether there was any backlighting effect that was taking place at the time of the incident?
I don't recall asking that specific question, no.
And you know what backlighting does to the person that's seated in a chair, and someone's standing in front of him, and the theater screen is bringing light behind that person, right?
Depending on all the lighting conditions, yes, it can obscure or cause glare, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
Did you ask Mrs. Reeves the type of previews that were playing at the time of the incident?
As far as types, I guess I
Yeah,
don't
like, you
understand what
know,
mean.
Sabotage, RoboCop, you know, those action-packed.
Oh, as to what clips? No, sir, I did
Yeah.
not.
You realize that if it's an action, if it's a RoboCop, a Sabotage, they tend to be louder, right?
It could be, yes, sir.
Certainly louder than a love story, right?
Probably, yes.
Okay, so now you interview Mrs. Reeves without a recorder, and your next subject is Matt Reeves, correct?
Yes, sir.
And Matt Reeves is the son of Curtis Reeves.
Yes, sir.
You learned that,
Yes.
right? You learned that he was a Tampa police officer as well
Yes.
at the time,
Yes, sir.
correct? And you interviewed him without a recorder.
Correct.
Now, in addition to interviewing him, you asked him to draw a diagram for you, correct?
No, sir. I recall drawing a diagram in my notes showing like the ramp entrance to the theater, and I remember asking Matthew about where he was and where he had come in about it.
He actually drew on that diagram, did he not?
I do not recall him drawing on the diagram, no, sir.
Well, certainly if he had drawn on that diagram, that's a piece of evidence, right?
Yes, sir, it could be.
And that piece of evidence should not be destroyed, because later on, again, we can show it to the court, we can show it to the jury, and they can see exactly what was taking place in the conversation between you and Mr. Reeves.
I don't necessarily think it would show the conversation, but definitely if witness had drawn a diagram, I would consider that, yes, that would be, could be important evidence.
Did you know at the time that Matthew Reeves was the individual that actually caught Mr. Oulson as he was falling to the ground?
At some point in my interview, I would have known that. I don't necessarily know if that would have been when I was asking him where he was or not.
So you knew certainly that at the time of the shooting, he was in the theater.
Yes, sir.
You would agree that both the interview of Mrs. Reeves and the interview of Matthew Reeves was extremely short.
I would say there were probably 30 to 40 minutes, probably.
30 to 40 minutes, that's what
Yes,
you
sir.
recall.
Yes, sir.
Now, you had learned by that time that Mr. Reeves was a former law enforcement officer, correct?
I was aware of that through the interview with his wife and son, yes.
Retired captain,
Yes, sir.
highly trained in the use of force, and you learned all that.
Your Honor, I'm going to object.
It's the same argument, Your Honor.
I'll overrule for now.
There's no predicate for that right now.
Approach.
View of both Mrs. Reeves and Matt Reeves. The interview was very general. You just basically let them tell you a story.
Generally speaking, when I start interviewing people and in the interview training that I've had, that's how you start your first interview. You want to give the person the opportunity to give as much detail as they remember before you start interrupting with questions or before you ask specifics. So yes, that's how you begin an interview, just asking them really basic questions as to what happened or what they observed.
Page 1297, lines 12 through 16.
Document.
Hearing. Detective, you remember a hearing in 2017 before this court?
Yes, sir.
And me asking you questions under oath?
Yes, sir.
Remember the following questions and answers. Question: so your interview of both of these witnesses, we're talking about both Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, Mrs. Reeves and Matt Reeves. So your interview of both of these witnesses were very general, and you just, it's supposed to say let, it says met, it's a typo.
Okay.
And you just let them tell their story. Very few questions on your part. Your answer: yes, sir. It was more a preliminary interview to find out what they had seen.
Yes, sir.
So you didn't ask many questions of them,
I'm sure I asked some questions. Yes, sir.
but not many, because that's what you said under oath in 2017, right?
As far as the number of questions I asked, I really don't recall.
You would agree that your recollection in 2017 is much better than your recollection in 2022.
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you just asked.
You would agree that your recollection back in 2017 would have been better than your recollection in 2022.
I would imagine that, yes, I would have forgotten some things over time.
Now, you were aware that Mr. Reeves was armed in that theater?
Yes, sir.
That did not alarm you?
I don't know if I understand.
No,
what you
because
mean.
your position is retired law enforcement carry firearms all the time, right?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, there is a federal statute that even encourages them to carry firearms, correct?
It doesn't necessarily encourage, but it certainly gives them authorization if they qualify to carry in more areas than your average person with a concealed permit, yes.
So you don't think that that federal statute encourages them? Is that what you're telling the jury?
That it encourages them?
Leosa, you're familiar with
Yes, sir.
Leosa, right?
Yes, sir, I
Okay.
understand.
Are you telling me that Leosa does not encourage retired officers to carry firearms?
I think the intent of the statute when it was written was to give the ability to have more armed, trained officers in public, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, when you left that interview, you never told Sergeant Harris that both Matt and Mrs. Reeves had indicated that the theater was dark and that the noise levels were pretty high of the previews. Never told Sergeant Harris that.
I don't remember.
Objection, hearsay.
You never told Sergeant Harris that, correct?
I don't remember making those specific statements, no.
He was the police officer that was supervising you there at the scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you've indicated to the jury already that darkness and noise is an important factor in this case, right?
It's an important factor in deciding your actions, yes, sir.
But you don't tell the sergeant that assigned you to this responsibility.
I had conversation with him, telling him what I had gathered from the interview. I don't remember specifically if I said that to him or not, no.
Those were the instructions, right? Interview the individuals and report to Harris, because Harris was going to try and disseminate that information to others, correct?
Yes, sir. As a general practice, we meet periodically throughout the investigation to share information so that other people are aware of what's going on.
That's pretty important, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
That communication?
Yes, sir.
It's not the first time that you've been in this situation to have to do that, right?
Correct.
But you told Sergeant Harris that you had interviewed both of these individuals, and it was at this point in time that you were assigned the lead crime detective, crime scene detective,
Crime scene detective, yes, sir.
right? This is when it happened, when you approached Sergeant Harris with your statements.
I'm sure probably a short period of time went by, because after I completed that task, Detective Harris probably had to decide who was going to cover what roles. So, yes, sometime shortly after that, he assigned me as a crime scene detective.
Okay, and so now you've got this pretty awesome responsibility, correct?
It's important, yes, sir.
Top two detectives on a case, right?
Again, I think it depends on the case, but I do think it's an important role, yes.
Okay, and so knowing that and anticipating that you're going to be going into this crime scene, you realized that, you know, one of your jobs was to assess the possible distractions that individuals there in that theater were experiencing at the time of the shooting. That's an important issue, right? Distractions.
I guess it's a difficult question to answer, because I'm not necessarily going to know by looking at the physical evidence on the scene what all the distractions would be, because I wasn't present when the event actually happened.
Well, you certainly want to preserve evidence as a crime scene detective, right?
Yes, sir.
And evidence can take various forms, right?
Yes.
And some evidence can be evidence that distracts people. For example, noise can be a distractor, right?
Noise could be a distraction, yes, sir.
And certainly light conditions can be a distractor as well, right?
Yes, sir.
And so you want to capture all those things, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to recreate and preserve the scene as it occurred at the time of the shooting. That's your job.
When you first start processing a scene, it's to document everything as to where it is. Not necessarily to recreate then, but to document thoroughly, collect the items so that if you need to go back and review, then yes, the scene could be recreated through what you've collected.
But that first step is you have to secure the evidence before you can use it later on to recreate, right?
Yes, sir.
And so if you don't secure that evidence, all of the evidence that's necessary and material, then when you try to recreate, you got missing pieces, right?
Yes, sir.
That's bad. In any case, right?
You definitely do not want to miss evidence. You typically usually do because you don't necessarily know the relationship of certain things, so you try to be as thorough as possible and collect everything you can that appears to be probative to what's the investigation and what's going on.
If you don't capture critical evidence, that's bad.
Yes, you definitely don't want to miss something.
And especially in a homicide case, right?
I don't think it necessarily is any more important than any other criminal investigation or
Oh, you
proceeding.
don't? So you don't think a homicide case is more
Your Honor, I'm
important?
going to object. I think the witness should have the opportunity to finish.
My
his answer.
apologies, Judge. My apologies. Yes.
We want to have the same level of thoroughness in every investigation. A sexual battery case is just as important to a victim. There's lots of other types of, violent crimes, robberies, so I think that they need to be treated with the same thoroughness. Yes, sir.
You think that a petty theft, the consequences for missing evidence in a petty theft is just as serious as missing evidence in a...
It's argumentative. He explained and he laid the parameters. Now it's just argumentative.
I'll sustain.
So, when you went into that scene, that crime scene, there were individuals that were already working the scene that had no direction from you whatsoever.
Yes, sir. I came in after processing had started.
And those individuals that had already entered the scene and were working the scene were what we call crime scene technicians, right?
We label them as forensic investigators.
Forensic investigators. They're
Yes,
not
sir.
police officers, though.
No, they're not sworn law enforcement.
Okay. And so those forensic investigators were in there doing something, right? You don't know what they were doing, because you had just come into the scene, right?
Yes, when I walked in, I would not have known what they had processed yet at that point.
In fact, when you walked into that scene, you had no idea where Mr. Reeves' seat was during the time of the incident.
I had a general explanation that they'd been sitting towards the middle of the top row, but when I went in, I could honestly no, I would not have known specifically which seat it was.
Because that wasn't communicated to you by Sergeant Harris or anybody else prior to you going in.
The difficulty we had with the theater where there were no numbered seats, so I'm not sure if there was an understanding from anybody exactly which seats they were in yet, but that, again, I'm not sure.
And you were able to see when you went into the theater, you were able to see that there was a cell phone on that top row. Let's call it row A.
Yes, sir.
And that cell phone was towards the middle of that row. Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
And you were able to see that as from your vantage point as you were walking the scene. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
But since you didn't know what seat Mr. Reeves was, you really didn't know the significance of that cell phone at that time.
Obviously, it was an item of evidence that was significant, as, many other things were. There was obvious spilled popcorn on the floor, things like that in that same area. So, yes, I knew them to be important, but no, I guess I did not know in relation to where they were seated where that was.
You didn't know what role that phone played, if any.
At that point, I did not, no, sir.
Okay. And certainly prior to going into that crime scene, nobody had told you that Mr. Reeves had indicated that he had possibly been hit with a cell phone in the head. Nobody had told you that.
No, I had not been told that.
In fact, you don't even know when that information was told to you.
I do not recall the first time someone told me that, no, sir.
You don't even know who told you.
I would imagine it was probably
Well,
Detective
we're not
Proctor,
imagining,
but...
we're in a court of law.
Yes, sir.
Assuming you know it's quite dangerous.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to him lecturing the witness.
I'm just
Next
asking him a
question.
question concerning that issue.
Well, he was about to finish and you cut him off, so let's refrain from doing that, and I'll sustain.
You would agree, would you not, that assuming things in a court of law is inappropriate?
I would, yes, agree with that. I guess I apologize for the wording of that. Most of my interactions were with Detective Proctor, and most of the conversations I had, so it would be likely that he would be the one to tell me that, but I do not recall specifically.
Okay. You didn't know at this point in time either, when you went into the scene, that this was even the possibility of a self-defense case.
I think I understood when I walked in that there'd been some sort of argument or disagreement because of my interviews with Matthew and Vivian. So, yes, I guess I would have some understanding that that could be an argument.
And so I would imagine then that those issues that we talked about just earlier on direct examination, distance, lighting, noise, all those things that could affect someone's perception, immediately from the beginning of your investigation was critical.
I guess I don't understand exactly what you're asking.
Preserving it.
Preserving.
You wanted to preserve the lighting conditions, did you not?
At the time we were in there, no, we actually turned all the lights on so we could see better the physical evidence and gather.
So are you telling the ladies and gentlemen of the jury that you didn't want to, at any point in time, turn those lights down to mid-level 1, which was the previews, and experience that level yourself? That was not important to you.
Your Honor, I would object to relevancy. It doesn't matter if it's important to the detective. It would be important to, well, who's prior approach.
Yeah.
Detective,
Yes.
was it important for you to preserve the lighting conditions?
I think it's important to try to understand the conditions, yes, sir. I don't necessarily know what you mean by preserving them.
Well, did you ask management there to turn the lights down to the position that it was during the previews?
We did have the lights adjusted at different points while we were there and taking photographs. I don't remember asking that specific question to say.
When you're saying that you were asking management to turn the lights higher so that you could see, is what you're talking about there, right?
We actually did both because we were taking photographs of the seats and we had some difficulty capturing it because of the different darkness, lightness levels. So we had somebody controlling the light switch in there and putting it to different levels.
But you did not ask management, put the lighting conditions as it was during the previews. You never asked management that question.
I don't specifically remember asking that, no, sir.
And you could have.
I could have, yes, sir.
And you could have stood there with the previews that were playing, with the lighting conditions the way they were, and you could have experienced that yourself.
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
You could have done that, right?
Objection, relevance.
Move on.
Okay. Have you heard of light meters?
Yes, sir, I have.
Have you ever used a light meter?
Not personally, no, sir.
You know that light meters measure the amount of light in a particular area, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then an expert can come and testify concerning the lighting conditions in that particular area based upon the light meter.
I would suppose if there was an expert in that area, yes, they could.
And there's something called a noise meter as well.
Yes, sir.
And law enforcement uses noise meters because sometimes you've got these people out there that are playing their music way too loud, right?
We have used noise meters for vehicle noise levels, different things like that for, yes, sir.
And you can capture the noise, and then you can come before a court and an expert can and explain the actual noise level.
I would assume they could, yes, sir.
You didn't do either of those?
I did not use a light meter or a sound meter, no, sir.
Did you call the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and say, hey, guys, help me out here? Do you all have a light meter? Do you all have a noise meter that we can bring out to the scene so that we can capture as much evidence as humanly possible from this crime scene?
I did not reach out to anybody to get a noise or light meter, no, sir.
Did you reach out to the FBI? The FBI was involved in this case, right?
Yes, they were.
Okay, did you reach out that day, January 13th, 2014, to the FBI and say, hey, FBI, come on, give me some help here. I need a noise meter, I need a light meter?
I did not ask anybody for a noise or a light meter that day, no, sir.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about cameras and video.
Yes, sir.
When you went into the theater, it was clear to you that there are 2 cameras on each side of the wall, right?
There was 1 camera on each side, sir.
Excuse me, 1 on each side,
Yes, sir.
about 30-some feet up.
I don't know the exact height, but they were pretty tall on the wall, yes.
Okay. And again, that perked your interest to, hey, there's possibly some surveillance equipment that's capturing what's happening in this theater, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you would agree that because the cameras were situated up high, that they could probably capture some overall down, right? Visuals?
Yes, sir. I didn't know the exact angle that the cameras would show.
But that view was going to be much different than someone seated in theater seat number 9.
Yes, sir.
In other words, what you can perceive in theater seat number 9 may be far different than what this camera is capturing 35 feet up in the air.
It's going to capture the same incident, but the perspective is going to appear different because it's a different location.
It's like going to a football game and sitting up in the nosebleed section and you can see a play develop, but you really can't see what's happening in the nitty-gritty line when individuals are, not playing kosher, right? Some of them are holding, some of them are using their hands illegally, and the refs can't see it, but they can do what they do right there at that line, right? It happens all the time.
You can definitely see or observe different things from different perspectives because certain things may be blocked from view depending on where you are. So yes, it does make a difference where you are.
So if you're on that line, you're going to be able to see certain things that that camera may not be able to capture in a football stadium.
That's true, yes, sir.
Okay. Forensic investigator Parrish and forensic investigator Garrison, when you walked in, were working that theater, correct?
Yes, sir, they were.
Okay. And do you know who they had received their orders from?
I would imagine it would be probably a combination of Detective Harris and Captain Steffens, who was the forensics chief at that point, but I don't know for sure who they spoke with.
You certainly didn't give them any direction whatsoever as to what they were to do with reference to measurements, right?
I don't recall any specific direction towards things. They were taking measurements as they went to different items, but I don't remember a specific direction that I gave.
Well, since you were in charge of the crime scene, why didn't you meet with them and give them specific direction concerning measurements?
There was definitely discussion between all of us, and measurements are a basic thing that we do at essentially every crime scene. So I knew that was part of the process that was going to get done.
Meaning you left it up to them?
I left it up to them certainly to do it because they're the trained forensic investigators. They have more training than I do in the actually making it happen and recording it. So I would probably take whatever they say is weighted heavily, how they wanted to do it.
You didn't give them any direction whatsoever in measurement, did you? You didn't tell them, hey, listen, come here, forensic investigator, I want you to measure from this seat, the very front of this seat to the very back of this particular seat. And then I also want you to measure from an angle from that cup holder to this particular, you didn't do any of that.
I don't remember specific direction on any specific measurement, no.
The only direction that you remember giving the crime scene investigators was, hey guys, take the best quality photographs with the lighting conditions.
There were multiple discussions, I think, between all of us, and probably most specifically with investigator Parrish, because I think she took the majority of the photographs. But yes, we definitely had discussion over trying to capture the best quality photographs we could.
That was your main focus as a crime scene detective there at that scene. Hey, let's get good photos.
That was the thing in that particular scene that was proving the most problematic, only because of the dark colors of the floors and different things. So I think that, yes, that probably got the most discussion or attention.
And even though it got the most discussion, they didn't do a very good job, right?
I think they did do a good job.
Well, wait a minute. I thought you had to come 10 days later with other equipment in order to be able to capture correctly the theater.
I don't believe that it was an issue of correctness. It was the fact that we wanted to try to get the best quality that we could, and we wanted to bring in further lighting only because we couldn't get it quite as bright enough inside as we would like.
On the date of the incident, you couldn't get photos that were light enough to be able to critically see. You remember that one photo of the spent casing on the ground that you looked at and you said, where is it? Right? You remember that?
I don't specifically remember asking where is the casing. I do remember seeing that some of the photos were dark, and I remember the photo of the casing was against the black floor, and yes, it was dark.
You also remember that the placards that were placed on the seats themselves, you couldn't even read them.
You can in certain photographs, but they're washed out on others, yes.
And so you realize, do you not, that these forensic investigators have cameras that when they take a photo, you can actually see what it looks like.
You can see a small display of the photo, yes.
Did you ask them to see any of the photos that night when they were taking the photos so that you could approve them or disapprove them?
I don't recall specifically doing that, no.
Do you realize that the forensic investigators had the lighting to do proper photos in their van outside the theater, but they weren't using them?
I know that they do carry a lot of different equipment with them. I don't specifically know what was in the van.
Or did you ask them, since you were having these problems with photos, did you say, hey guys, you have any better lighting in your truck?
I remember using lighting that we had, flashlights at different times to help illuminate. I don't specifically remember asking that, no.
You think a flashlight is a proper form of illuminating in a crime scene?
It can be, yes, sir.
It wasn't, right? Because it wasn't giving you sufficient light, was it?
I think it would depend on each individual photo, because certain photos showed good detail and other photos were a little bit lesser detail.
And we can't afford to have lesser detail, right?
As all things we do in our investigation, we want to try to get the highest quality that we possibly can with the equipment and the conditions that we have.
So knowing that there was a camera there, knowing that there was a video surveillance system there, the beauty of having as many officers as you all had there at the Cobb Theater is that you had officers from all different specialties, correct?
We had definitely several different specialties because it was kind of an emergency call that came in. So some of the detectives, excuse me, from property crimes had shown up, some of the detectives from vice and narcotics. So yes, we had several different specialty units.
And the most important, cybercrime, right?
I believe Detective Basone was there, who was assigned to cyber crimes at the time, yes.
Detective Lindsay?
I don't believe Detective Lindsay was on the scene when I got there. I believe he went to the hospital.
Detective Papinella?
I don't recall if Detective Pepinella was there or not.
Those were the three detectives that actually started the cybercrime unit for the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, right?
I think Detective Oulson came in a little bit later, but yes, I believe Detective Lindsay and Detective Pepinello were both the original detectives assigned to that unit.
That was a big deal for the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. There was a lot of man-hours that went into training those officers, correct?
Over time, yes.
In fact, they became quite an elite group.
Yes, sir, I believe
And
so.
certainly by January the 13th of 2014, they were quite an elite group.
I do believe that they had quite a bit of knowledge, yes, sir.
And you knew, did you not, that Sergeant Sessa had specifically assigned Detective Oulson to capture and preserve the video surveillance that took place on January 13th, 2014. You were aware that Sergeant Sessa had specifically directed Detective Oulson to do that.
I don't think I was aware that Sergeant Sessa was necessarily involved. I do remember having discussion with Detective Oulson that he'd been requested to try to get copies of the video, yes.
And he told you he had been requested by the sergeant.
I honestly don't remember if I knew specifically who had requested it.
Well, chain of command is important because you have individuals that are sergeants, captains, and what have you that may have more experience than you.
Yes, sir.
And so if Oulson is telling you, hey, by the way, I've been asked by a supervisor to take this role on, I would imagine that you would respect that.
Yes, sir.
But you didn't, did you? You told Detective Oulson, who was a highly trained officer in cybercrime, you told him, you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. That's what you told Oulson. Oulson, this is my crime scene, I'm the crime scene detective, you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it.
I
Right?
definitely did not tell him that, no, sir.
What did you tell him?
So Detective Oulson had informed me that he'd spoken to management at the theater and requested copies of the video. What he'd been told was it was going to take several hours to back up the video, so it wasn't going to be available that day. So Detective Oulson and I are very good friends and have been. So it was going to be an issue of coming to pick up video that was already downloaded for us, and I simply told him that I could take care of it when it was done because the crime scene and the physical evidence in the building was my overall responsibility.
You think that Detective Oulson was going to let Cop Theater copy the video? Is that what you're telling the ladies and gentlemen of the jury? You think that's what he was going to do?
Yes, sir, that's what he told me he did.
You know that that's not the protocol for cybercrime, right? The protocol for cybercrime is no, private entities don't do that, we do it.
No, sir, that's not correct.
So you're perfectly fine with having the Cop Theater where a shooting has taken place and they have possible civil liabilities, you're okay with letting them do it?
Yes, sir, at that time and still currently, our policies and procedures allow an IT-controlled video system to be controlled by the IT department that owns it and hand the video to us, yes.
Do you know who was the IT individual that was, in your opinion, controlling?
I don't think on that day I knew, but I eventually learned it to be Eric
that
Andrews. I honestly don't remember if I knew the person's name on that day.
Do you know the level of competency or incompetency of that individual?
I did not know the individual in any
Do
way.
you know the reputation for honesty of that individual?
Again, I didn't know the individual in any way.
Do you know the alliance that that individual would have either with the Cobb Theater or with the Pasco County Sheriff's Department?
Again, I didn't know him at all.
And so you're letting a perfect stranger deal with a critical piece of evidence in a homicide case, and you think that that's the protocol of the Pasco County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, sir, I do.
Before allowing this unknown person to do whatever the unknown person was doing, did you at least go up to the IT room that very moment and go to see what was in the IT room?
I do not believe I went to the IT room that day, no, sir.
So you didn't go to the IT room to see how many DVRs were up there, right?
Not that day, no, sir.
So you didn't go up there and actually get the serial numbers and the models and make of those DVRs.
No, sir, I didn't.
And so you didn't go up there and get serial numbers of any of the hard drives,
I would not have been able to do that, sir, no.
and you had absolutely no idea what was in that room at the time that this incident occurred.
Again, I didn't go to the room that day, so I'm not aware. I was aware afterwards, but no, not that day.
Well, let me ask you this. Were you aware that corporate was at the very moment that you all were investigating this case, that corporate Cobb was remotely dialing in and viewing the video?
Objection, Your Honor, facts not in evidence.
My question is he aware of that?
Oliver will.
Were you aware that at the time that you were conducting this investigation, Cobb Corporate from Alabama was dialing in remotely and viewing that video?
The explanation that was given to me was that they had dialed in remotely and that they were backing up all of the video footage, but not reviewing it at that point.
So do you know who that person was in Alabama that was doing this remotely?
I did learn later on, but
No.
at that time, no, I did
That
not.
day, did you know?
That's the same individual I'd said before that I did not know at all.
And so, again, the same answers to all those questions. You didn't know that person's level of competency, you didn't know anything.
Correct.
Okay. You certainly must have known that the Cobb Theater certainly had a liability interest in this case, right?
They could, yes.
You never asked management at all, you yourself, to even see the video at that moment.
I'd had some discussions with the manager, Tom Peck, who was there, who I believe is the one who gave me the explanation that we couldn't view it because it was being backed up. And I think that was the extent of the
So
conversation.
you're telling this jury that Thomas Peck said that you could not view it because...
Objection, hearsay.
Yes, we testified to.
No, it was hearsay then.
Well, you didn't object to it then.
Sustained.
Okay, so let's go to the issue of what happens in that crime scene as you are trying to gather evidence and preserve evidence. You've indicated already that you've left measurements up to the forensic unit. You're working with them trying to get better quality photos, correct?
Yes, sir.
You did nothing with reference to the loudness of the previews or the lighting conditions, correct?
No, sir, we did not have the previews turned on.
And so tell me exactly what is it that you were doing in that crime scene? How long were you in that crime scene?
I'd estimate probably 2 to 3 hours.
So tell me what you were doing for 2 or 3 hours in that crime scene if you weren't doing any of that.
Upon my first arrival, I did a walkthrough of the crime scene so I could observe different items, things that I saw, to be able to describe them in my report. I would have had multiple discussions with the different technicians or the forensic investigators that were there to find out what they had seen, what steps they were taking. I probably would have had several conversations with Detective Harris back and forth, so there were multiple things going on over time, possibly answering questions that any of the investigators might have had.
Okay, and so certainly in none of those conversations had the name Joanna Turner ever come up.
I don't remember that name, no, sir.
You know who she is today.
I do know who she is now, but not at that time, I don't believe.
In fact, The name Joanna Turner didn't come up that day, period, that entire day.
To me, not that I'm aware of, no, sir.
And the whole purpose of these meetings with the brass is so that you all would exchange critical information. Right?
Yes, sir.
I mean, that's what you want at the end of the day. Give me all the critical information so that we can maybe do some things here at the scene that will help in the overall investigation, right?
It's so everybody involved has an understanding of what's going on, not just in the crime scene, but with what the status of the investigation, different witnesses. So it's just overall information sharing.
In fact, on January the 13th, 2014, nobody had even told you that Mr. Reeves had indicated that he was possibly struck with a phone.
All rule.
On January 13th, 2014, nobody even told you that Mr. Reeves had possibly been struck with a phone.
While I was in the crime scene, I don't recall anybody telling me that. If by the end of that day, I don't know for sure when I learned it. If it was by the end of that day or possibly the following day, I don't recall.
Detective, how does that happen? How does that happen when Proctor is interviewing Mr. Reeves early on? Tell me how that happens, that that information doesn't get to you.
I don't know that I have an answer for that, sir.
You're certainly disappointed, are you not, that it never got to you?
In hindsight, I would have liked to have known it then, yes, sir.
And the reason that you're so concerned about that is that you had a conversation, did you not, with the crime scene forensic tech, whatever you want to call it, concerning that phone that was on the ground. You had a conversation because she asked you, hey, what do you want me to do with this phone? Hey, what do you want me to do with this phone? You want me to turn it off?
Yes, she did specifically ask me if it should be powered off or on.
She picked up that phone from the floor with gloves on
Yes, sir.
and started manipulating the phone to turn it off.
There, you have to manipulate the buttons on the phone to get it to turn off, yes, sir.
Because you didn't know that that phone was possibly used to strike Mr. Reeves in the head.
We would have taken the same steps to collect it. I was not aware that that accusation had been made. No, sir.
Well, certainly you didn't talk to her about, hey, forensic investigator, we need to be very careful. Wait a minute. That may have some DNA on it. Wait a minute. We need to do something special with this phone. You didn't do that, did you?
I did not ask for any DNA processing on the scene, no, sir.
Because you know if someone is manipulating a phone, that possibly the DNA that is so critical in a case may go away on your glove.
It's possible it could get wiped off,
Or
yes,
it
sir.
may be mixed and distorted as a result of the holding process, right?
The reason we wear gloves is to try to stop that kind of contamination from happening, and the way we package it for the same reason. But could it be possible to contaminate a piece of DNA evidence? Yes, it could be possible.
Well, and you all don't even put the glove that you use to pick up the phone in the package or in a separate package so that that can be analyzed as well for transfer DNA.
We definitely would not package it with the same item because that would be contaminating it for sure, most likely. But generally speaking, no, we don't package gloves as a matter of course. If there was a specific, say there was blood that got transferred to the glove accidentally or something, we may, but yeah, no, not as a matter of
So
course.
blood's okay, but transfer DNA, let's not worry about it.
So throughout the processing, excuse me, throughout the processing of the crime scene, that investigator is going to be touching multiple things with that pair of gloves.
Well,
So-
you wouldn't have allowed that. Had you known that that phone had been thrown to Mr. Reeves and that it had possibly hit him in the head, you were not going to allow that crime scene investigator to use a glove that she was using all over that theater. You would have said, ma'am, new gloves. If you're going to pick up that phone, we're going to have to pick it up in such a way that we do not destroy evidence, right? That's what you would have done.
If we were going to process it for DNA on the scene, yes, we would definitely use a clean pair of gloves and
And you would
swabs.
have told her, after you're done with that glove, don't touch anything else and put it in a bag so that we can determine whether there's transfer DNA on those gloves.
Generally speaking, no, because the swabbing would be done on the item itself. We would preserve the swabs that we took from the device, not necessarily the gloves.
What's wrong with swabbing the gloves? Is there some chemical that destroys the glove if we swab it?
It's not an issue of destroying the glove. It's an issue of that investigator would have had to touch the gloves putting on. There's a risk of contamination, so.
Have you heard of grabbing the gloves right from here, right? And you take them off, and then you put them in a bag, and you let the forensic lab that are very good at what they do, don't they?
Yes, sir.
FDLE has a great lab, don't they?
Yes, they do.
And they do things with precision, right? Correct?
I've never worked in there, but I would imagine so, yes.
And you are amazed sometimes of what they can find, right?
They've done very good work for cases, in the past. Yes, sir.
Especially in the area of DNA.
I have had them had success in DNA cases, yes.
There are cases that are 20 years old that get solved through DNA in the most remote places, right?
I can't speak to a specific timeline, I'm not sure. No,
And
sir.
your job as a crime scene detective is to preserve evidence, right?
It's to coordinate the preservation of evidence, yes, sir.
Oh, so somebody else is responsible for preservation? Just, you're supposed to coordinate it, everybody else is responsible.
So our policy outlines the responsibilities of the crime scene detective as a person who coordinates it, and it further outlines the responsibilities for forensic investigators, and that they will be the ones actually handling and processing the evidence. Yes, sir.
So you're kicking the responsibility to some forensic investigators, what you're telling the ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
I don't understand which responsibility you mean, sir.
When you're a crime scene detective, you're responsible to make sure that everything gets done perfect.
Nothing is ever done perfectly, sir.
You certainly want to strive for perfection, do you not?
Perfection, in my opinion, doesn't exist. We want to strive to do the best quality job we possibly can.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So she picks up the phone, right? And days later, let me ask you this question. Days later, did you know that there was an allegation that the phone possibly hit Mr. Reeves in the head? Days later.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And days later, you went into the evidence room, opened up the evidence bag that contained the phone with gloves, grabbed the phone, turned it on to see who it belonged to.
Yes, sir, I did.
That was not good. That was not a good decision on your part, right?
I think it was a good decision based on the information we had and the overall discussion or opinion of everyone involved in this.
You had an opinion already by photo that that phone belonged to Mr. Oulson from his wife.
No, sir, the discussion that we had is we couldn't conclusively say it was his phone. We had made some assumptions that it did belong to Mr. Oulson. So after this discussion with the command staff, with Detective Proctor, with our bosses and other detectives, the decision was made that we wanted to confirm that it belonged to Mr. Oulson.
Did you take a photograph to Mrs. Oulson and say, Mrs. Oulson, take a look at this phone. Is this your husband's phone?
I believe we did ask her if she recognized it and believed it.
And she
yes.
told you, that is my husband's phone.
I'm going to ask that he allow the witness to.
My apologies, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Detective, did she tell you that that was her husband's phone?
I believe she said she recognized it to be the same type of phone as his, yes.
Same type, or did she tell you, that is my husband's phone?
I don't recall the exact statement she made.
And so, tell me what was so critical that you could not let the DNA, actually it's not even the lab, your forensic investigators, right there in that same office that you all work out of, why could you not get your investigators to say, hey, listen, forensic, come on over to this room. I want you to swab this phone before I pick it up to turn it off, to turn it on to see if it was Mr. Oulson's phone. That wouldn't have been hard.
Their physical location, yes, is in the same building. Had I made the request, I'm sure they would have come over and done it.
Immediately.
I don't know if immediately, but at some point, I would imagine relatively soon.
But you didn't do that
I did not make a request for DNA processing, no.
at that moment.
No, sir.
And so it was okay to risk the destruction of evidence when it was so easy to contact a forensic investigator to do their job, right? Let's just, who cares, right?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question, sir.
It's simple. A phone call, a few minutes, the swabbing doesn't take a whole lot of time, right? You've seen that, right?
The swabbing is relatively simple, yes, sir.
And very quickly, right?
Relatively, yes.
Okay. And you knew at the time that that phone could have been used as a weapon.
Objection, asked and answered.
Sustained.
You never weighed that phone, did you?
I did not weigh it, no, sir.
Was the weight of that phone important to you in your investigation as the crime scene detective? It is a piece of evidence now that you knew that the allegation was made, right?
It was a piece of evidence from the time we arrived, sir.
Why wouldn't weighing it be important?
I do believe it got weighed at some point during the overall investigation, but we did not weigh it that day.
You weighed it after the defense weighed it.
I believe so, yes.
So we had to think of it. You didn't think of it.
I never made a specific request to have it weighed, no, sir.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the video again, because that's an important piece of evidence. So you've left it up to the Cobb Theater to do whatever the Cobb Theater was doing, and you find out 2 days later that right under your nose, the Cobb Theater in Alabama had sent over their IT person in the middle of the night to take the hard drives and seize them and take them out of the Cobb Theater. You found that out.
I did find out at some point that they had removed the hard drives. I don't remember specifically which day it was that I found out, though.
This was the group that you had so much confidence in. Did they call you, Cobb Theater call you and say, hey, detective, I just want to let you know that we are going to go into the Cobb Theater, we're going to seize all of the hard drives, and then we're also going to just dismantle the entire DVR system, and we're going to put something brand new. Did they call you to tell you that?
No, sir, they did not call me.
In fact, you only found out that the hard drives had been seized and removed. Seized even more critically. You knew that there was an officer that had been posted there at the Cobb Theater with tape so that nobody would come through, right?
As far as security on the entrance, yeah,
Yeah.
I believe we did that for several days because I think they closed the theater for a while.
And so there was an officer there making sure that nobody was going to go into the theater and do anything.
No, sir, it was not preserved as a crime scene at that point. We released the crime scene on the day that it occurred. I believe it was mainly at the request of Cobb for security.
Well, that night, some IT person from Melbourne
Yes, sir.
came in and just walked in and
Objection, facts not in evidence.
he knew that it was.
Sustained.
So now 2 days later when you find out that the hard drives have been taken away right under your nose to Alabama, you think to yourself, uh-oh, big problem, right? It was a big problem for you.
No, sir, it wasn't a problem. We did have discussion. In a case like this, we never would have suggested the removal of the hard drives because we'd already retrieved reliable copies of the video through normal manners or normal procedures. So once we learned that they had removed them, we knew obviously that they could still be considered items of evidence in the state that we're in, so we decided to secure them just so that we had them for any further analysis and just security purposes.
Oh, wait a minute, what do you mean by you had secured reliable video? You didn't know who had copied any video for you? You didn't know who that person was?
By that time, I did, sir, yes.
Well, who was the person that, in Alabama, that copied the video for you?
It was their IT manager, Eric Andrews.
Okay, and so by that time you knew that Eric Andrews, did you know anything about Eric Andrews? Did you know him personally?
Did not know him personally, no,
Did you
sir.
know anything about his education?
No, sir.
Did you know anything about his training?
No, sir, I did
Did
not.
you know anything about his reputation for truthful and honesty?
I didn't, like, on personal basis, I did not know him.
But you knew that
personally.
he worked for the Cobb Theater, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you knew that maybe his alliance was with his boss rather than with you, correct?
I don't know that he had an alliance with anybody, but I did know he was employed by Cobb Theater, yes.
And so now you and Detective Proctor go all the way, hop in your car, right? 2 days later, how many days was it? 2, 3, 4? What was it?
I want to say it was probably about a week.
A week.
I would have to double check, though.
A week later, you get in your car and you go to Alabama, but you don't go to corporate headquarters. You go to the office of a lawyer for the Cobb Theater.
Yes, sir.
Now, prior to going to the Cobb Theater, prior to going to Alabama, did you even know who the IT person was that came in the middle of the night to remove the hard drives?
I don't think that I personally knew his name, no, sir.
So you hadn't investigated that person or even why Cobb Theater found it so urgent that the night of the incident, they were wanting to get their hands on the hard drives.
I don't believe it was the night of the incident, sir, because it took several hours for them to back up the footage, and they wouldn't have been able to remove the drives until that was all complete.
So you don't even know what time this gentleman came?
Not off the top of my head, no, sir.
So you would be surprised if he arrived at the Cobb Theater somewhere between 7 and 8 on January the 13th of 2014. You'd be surprised. 8 years later from that incident, you would be surprised.
As I said before, I was not aware of what day he showed up.
And the reason you're not aware is that you never investigated that gentleman, did you?
No, sir, I did not.
You never even spoke to that gentleman, did you?
I have spoken with him, I believe. At one point, we were asking details about the type of DVR system that they had made for it, but I think it was like a simple phone call.
Or did you ask him why it was so necessary that the Cobb Theater at 7 to 8 o'clock at night would find the need to send him from Melbourne over here to get those hard drives and fly them to Alabama?
I did not ask him any question about the removal.
Did you
hard
know
drives.
that Cobb Theater had flown an individual from Alabama to meet this gentleman there at the Cobb Theater so that they could take the hard drives immediately to Alabama?
I think I learned that eventually, but at the time I went to Alabama, I don't believe I knew all those details now.
Well, do you know who that individual was that was flown from Alabama to come to the Cobb Theater to pick up those hard drives?
I do not personally know their identity, no, sir.
You never interviewed him?
No, sir, I did not.
You never spoke to him to see what his interest was in that whole process?
I did not speak to him, no, sir.
And so now you're at a lawyer's office
Yes, sir, in Birmingham.
that I would imagine had the interest of the Cobb Theater in mind.
He was obviously representing the theater.
Well,
'Cause
did you ask the lawyer, hey, why is this stuff at your
Objection,
office?
you can't, attorney-client privilege can't do that anyway.
Is ask. Ask.
Sustain.
Okay, so now you're at the lawyer's office, and the lawyer gives you a box or a case, right?
Yes, sir, it was a hard plastic case.
What do they call those cases?
That particular one was a Husky case.
A Husky case. And so that case had a lock on it,
Yes, sir.
right? With a key that was given to you.
Yes, sir.
And in front of that lawyer's office, or in front of that lawyer period, did you get that key and did you open the Husky case to see what was in it?
No, sir, I didn't. The box was sealed with a numbered seal, so I did not break that seal.
Well, didn't you want to know what was in the box?
I received an inventory sheet from the attorney outlining the different drives and the bag numbers that they were inside the box.
Did you know this attorney personally?
No, sir.
Did you know his level of honesty and truthfulness?
Objection, relevancy, proper.
I think it's very relevant, Your Honor.
All overruled.
Did you know?
I did not know him personally, no, sir.
And so you were taking for granted a piece of paper that he was giving you as to what the contents of that box was?
I was definitely taking it on face value because he was presenting me with something that we had never had before. We had never had the drives in our possession, so I did not have any knowledge or way to know how many drives there should have been or what was there. So I did take him, yes, on face value as to what he told me was in that box.
So you did inventory before leaving, you didn't inventory that in his presence so that later on if he said, oh, detective, I don't know what happened, you must have, lost them or what have you, but they were in there. Look at the sheet of paper, detective. It says, 25, hard drives. And, there's only 5. You had it. You should have opened it here in front of me. You never did that.
We inventoried it at a later date, but not at the attorney's office, no, sir.
Well, you inventoried it at a much later date, only through necessity, right?
At that point, the box had been opened, so we felt that we should account for what was in there, yes, sir.
Because what happened was, is you got that sealed box that had a lock, you brought it over to the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, to their evidence room, and you put that in evidence without ever opening that box,
Correct,
without ever doing any inventory of that box.
correct.
Do you normally do that with boxes that you find at crime scenes? It's a box, I don't know what's actually in it, but I'm gonna put it at the sheriff's office in their evidence room.
The box didn't come from a crime scene, and it came with documentation, like I said, from the attorney telling us what was in there, and the purpose for packaging in that way was to keep the seal intact. So if we did have to analyze it in any way or have someone come testify to it, that they could testify that they sealed the box and the seal was in fact intact.
You don't know why it was at the lawyer's office, do you?
I guess I don't understand what you mean.
You don't know why that box was not at corporate headquarters versus the attorney's office. You have no idea.
No, I don't know why they chose to store it where they did.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. Good time for a break. Let's take a 10-minute recess. Remember my instructions during the break, and be back 10:46.
All right, we're in the recess.